este tipo voy a estar.
Y este está activado, sí.
Hola, buenas tardes. Es para mí un placer volver a estar en este salón de actos de nuevo con un ciclo del Departamento de Proyectos Arquitectónicos que, como siempre, ha hecho una apuesta por las jóvenes generaciones del departamento. Ya sabemos que las jóvenes generaciones tienen 30 y pico y en algún caso casi 40, pero en este caso son las jóvenes generaciones del departamento y de la escuela. Estoy muy contento de tener a Piet Ecker, Argument 2, que es el nombre del nuevo ciclo, está jugando con la práctica dual, que es una práctica dual que a mí me parece extremadamente recomendable para todo el profesorado de esta escuela y que probablemente alguien me matará por decirlo, pero me parece maravilloso que la gente enseñe y tenga práctica profesional al mismo tiempo. Y esa enseñanza y esa práctica profesional y confrontar las dos es de lo que va a tratar este ciclo. Tenemos a Silvia Colmenares, subdirectora del departamento, a quien le daré la palabra ahora. Andrés Cánava, su director, se excusó con nosotros diciendo que no podía, no estaba en Madrid, está probablemente en la Bienal o yendo a Venecia en estos momentos, supongo. Tenemos también a los comisarios de este ciclo, a Pablo Oriol, a Fernando Rodríguez, a Fernando Pino y a Juan Elvira. Espero no haberme dejado a nadie dentro de la historia. Habéis visto que hay publicidad del programa en el pabellón nuevo, justamente en la entrada, igual que se estará anunciando todos los distintos programas del ciclo. Curiosamente, para los que no puedan dejar de ver a Piet Ecker otra vez más, lo podremos volver a ver el lunes por la mañana. Yo creo que es de las cosas más divertidas que me han pasado. Yo esta mañana me he sentido en el Día de la Marmota cuando me han invitado a presentar a Piet Ecker en una conferencia de la Cátedra Blanca el lunes a las 12:30 y he dicho, a ver, no era esta noche a las 7 de la tarde, pero está muy bien porque en esta escuela, que somos 5.000 personas, hay público en todo momento y en todos los horarios y en todas las historias. Silvia, enhorabuena al departamento una vez más por montar también esto y por contribuir tanto a la vida cultural y a la vida de la escuela y a entender cómo la escuela se entiende con otras universidades, en este caso Mendrisio, aunque Piet creo que ha estado absolutamente en todas partes, aparte de Mendrisio. Te dejo la palabra. Gracias.
Bueno, nada, mi papel aquí es simplemente, bueno, en nombre del departamento, daros la bienvenida, daros también las gracias por lo que es una asistencia bastante considerable. Hoy arrancamos este ciclo, bueno, gracias Manuel, sobre todo de verdad por estar aquí, que sabemos que tu agenda es muy apretada y que te agradecemos mucho que apoyes esta iniciativa del departamento. Como sabéis, iniciamos esta aventura de Argument el año pasado. Se trataba de dar un poco un sentido a todas estas invitaciones que hacíamos y el ciclo de conferencias organizados del departamento pudiera tener un hilo conductor y para eso pues montamos este programa que a lo mejor vosotros no lo sabéis, pero es una convocatoria abierta entre los profesores del departamento que tienen que hacernos una propuesta, ¿no? Y en este caso, el equipo, el año pasado sabéis que se llamaba Sampling Context, muchos de los que estáis aquí seguramente asististeis a las conferencias y este año, bueno, pues ya los ha presentado Manuel, pero son 4 profesores del departamento que tienen unos intereses comunes y que han sido capaces de poner encima de la mesa este argumento que os van a explicar y que han bautizado como Dual Practices, que es algo que yo creo que es muy pertinente en esta escuela. Creo que no se me ha estado oyendo nada hasta ahora mismo. Ah, vale, vale. Bueno, gracias a todos y os dejo con ellos, que son realmente los protagonistas hoy.
Bueno, y por último, para que no sea como muy aburrido, antes de que podamos tener a nuestro invitado, yo voy a cambiar directamente al inglés para que podamos escucharle a él ya con el oído un poco entrenado. So I'm going to introduce Piet Ecker. As Silvia said, this idea of dual practices is clearly linked to something that is happening, has been a main theme in our school, this idea of the link of academia and thought and thought of architecture with the practice of architecture, the fact of making it, actually, of building. We are celebrating OIZA's 10 years, 100 years, and it's clearly an example of this, and it's always been linked with our school. We wanted to just see how this could happen with other schools in Europe, this link, where could we find this link, powerful link between practice and academia in other schools, in other beautiful schools, powerful schools, and also like nice and well makers of the architecture around in the scene of the European profession. So we invited to start this Piet Eckert, who along with Wim, his brother, ran the office E2A in Zurich from 2001, I guess. And they also teach together in Mendrisio, in the Academia de Arquitectura, as guest professors. And we just felt that they were clearly one of the more powerful examples of this dual practice that we wanted to show you. They worked before establishing their office in Zurich for OMA, and they were having different kinds of practices in the city of Zurich before establishing their own practice and winning some competitions that pushed up their practice in the first years of this century. And you already know probably their work for the many monographs and publications in which they are published, okay? And there's probably something interesting that we will see, and it's about this idea of linking like some kind of idealism with a powerful realism in their proposals. So, Pete, please just join us, and the word to you.
So, thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you very much for this absolutely warm reception here at the ETSAM, which is, it's great to be here. I thought that this invitation to talk about the dual practice or this pivoting relationship between what we're trying to aim for as a teacher and what we're trying to aim as a practicing architect was a very seducing format of a lecture. And so I'm trying really to elaborate on these pivoting conditions of the two disciplines within the domain of architecture. I start with a film scene, and actually this is a scene from Fountainhead, done by King Vidor quite some years ago. And it says in the scene, we want you to adapt your building like this. Now, I'm using this to kind of elaborate that within the presentation of this project in that movie, the client, so to speak, invades the idea of the modernist architecture and juxtapose a kind of a classicist porticus or a classicist socle or a base to this architecture. And I use this scene because we have, let's say, or we have been taught by a generation of architects in Switzerland that were exposed to a very patronal system, or where the position of an architecture or of an architect itself was very strong, culturally founded. And we experienced in the last 20 years how the systematics and the economy and the market economy really changed, let's say, the position of the architecture in society, but also within the market itself as what the possibilities were. So, and let's say the idea that constraints and difficulties and let's say forces that are all circumstances, the architecture become very complex today. You could also say that architecture is very vulnerable as a discipline because you're depending on so many today. And the question is, for us as architects that want to practice, but also architects that want to teach, how do we anticipate with our course, or how do we anticipate with this issue about the weakening of the discipline itself, and how can we be creative or artistic in response to that? So my brother and me, we try to kind of formulate a strategy that not only is being concentrating, or that has been concentrated on the idea how we could practice, but also how we could actually teach. And we formed a studio in Mendrisio that was very much dealing with the idea of a strategic architecture. So what is that? So let's do some statements. So architecture may react on the context that is increasingly driven by the massive impact of social, political, and economic and ecological factors, attempting to maintain a singular sense of cohesion. Now, the idea of cohesion was very much based in the Swiss culture of the architecture, very much based in the mind of our teachers, that an architecture had to be, or had to deal with a cohesive, with a condition to bring things all together. But now, you can say the contemporary condition, the contradictory has become the contemporary program of our discipline. So you can say, while we've been trained to think about cohesion, the contemporary condition has eroded the circumstance to be or to develop a cohesive condition. So this is a contradictory condition, or this is a discrepancy. How can we deal with this? And we thought that we wanted to introduce a strategic organization of space that is one that actually mixes elements, or a strategy that allows us to mix a value system and action logics. You could say it opens up a combination of essential incoherences. So the target of strategic architecture is to manage the coexistence of conflicting values. So we try to shift in our own idea the imagination of cohesion, and we try to deal maybe with a idea of how we combine different values. So the result, going to the university and going to teach, is that we were very much interested in methodologies. So the strategic ideas that could actually be transformed into a kind of idea of methodologies that allows us not to bring the know-how or the experience of the practice into the school, in the sense to create a pseudo practice in the school. That's what we absolutely did not want to do. But to actually examining methodologies for our own sense of our own development of the architecture, as well as in a very artistic way in school, and then actually using this relationship to examine, to discover, so to speak. So you can also say to teach is not only to teach architecture, but it's also to learn from your students. And in this way, I thought it was kind of very important to rediscover ideas on methodologies. I've been asked to show a number of exercises, and of course we do this in a more general sense, because one exercise in itself would limit the discussion a bit, but I think I'm trying to give you an overview how we introduce that aspect on methodologies in our studio. So we formulated an idea of exercises that we say combining singularities. Now you remember I said that our teachers were very much into cohesion, and nowadays this idea of cohesion is kind of eroded, and the idea how you eventually could combine different singularities, this became a very, let's say, contemporary and a very interesting idea to react on, let's say, the contemporary condition. So it is the aim and the intention of our studio to investigate the formal and spatial generative possibilities when the notion of hybridization is applied. The combination of multiple architectural conditions within a single system inherently challenge the conventional view of a building identity and our notion and understanding of autonomous types. It could be seen as a tool to elaborate a specific combination of program, structure, typologies in order to deal with the discrepancies, or in other words, to systemize these found incoherencies. So mixing, assembling, arranging, composing diverse identity in order to obtain a new singularity, this was a kind of the first scope, the first years in Mendrisio, where we tried to examine these procedures and methodologies that were actually able to produce these ideas. It was, of course, also very interesting that very early Hugh Ferris in his publications developed this kind of almost mythical representation about the metropolis or the metropolitan condition. And most of the developments he used, he combined unbelievably gifted fundamental different types of architectural spaces. So almost the clerical, in this case, for example, how the clerical type or a clerical typology of space can be combined with a moment of high-rises or moment of neoliberalism, of awakening American Manhattanism in New York. So we found this a very inspiring key image of the studio, how to study combinations, mixing, and relations. It's one of our preferred artists, Jusovic, which with very clever manipulations is really able to give an object a total different twist of its original, you know. So this moment where he starts to combine manipulating a condition or an object that you still obviously are able to recognize, but the moment he kind of alienates it, mixes it, changes or manipulates it, it becomes a kind of an ambiguous body that is, let's say, retrieving his idea about the straight usage or functionality. So this we're trying to examine with our students, and developed exercises which we called dual body. It's interesting, so it's not about the studio and architecture or the practicing, but it's about a body that has this capacity to being two things at the same time. So that kind of dissolute to some extent, its own clarity of the one thing. You can say it's an ambiguous project, or how to create ambiguity. So every team of 2 students must focus on the production of a concept model, which is to emerge from the combination of different architectural typologies by producing a conceptual model as instrument of investigation. Each team will try to exemplify a specific condition of hybridity and interdependency. So it's another great work of an artist which we admire, which is Joep van Lieshout. So this unbelievable combination of cave and crypt, so to speak, or you can say prison, control, and the first bed of a human creates exactly this tension or this relation that we were searching. So we did many exercises. I'm trying to kind of extrapolate maybe a few ones just to highlight how the students actually reacted to it, and we called it this exercise 1 to kind of work yourself into a topic without the preconception or without the repertoire which you have learned so far. So it's a kind of discovery mode, so to speak. So to combine these 2 objects where it becomes a kind of an independent shower, the way actually it's being connected, the way that the one and the other is manipulating its original function, we were interested to, let's say, create the sensitivity among our students how an object or how a behavior could be studied, without the obligation to be too early exposed to an architectural language. Another example, which I found at the time very intriguing, and the question is always, if you do this exercise, what holds it together? How is it actually related? And the student find out that there are many different objects that have absolutely the same radial conditions, and just by meeting the same radius at the point, it kind of transcends basically the building, it transcends the original aspiration of the object, and it gets a complete new object that is similar to the art examples that I've showed, effectively broadens the idea of what it actually is and how it eventually could work. So from a dual relationship, we shifted the next step, and which became a kind of a second, almost a consecutive exercise, and we called it then the architectural body. And so the discovery was supposed to be translated into an architectural cultivated language that then would deliver basically the discovery that a student has done by the previous exercises. For me, this was almost an autobiographical example, because the image is Vincent de Rijk's workshop. This was the workshop where all the models from OMA in the 90s were produced, and this is the assembly of a kind of iconic architectural model, which is the concept model of the Très Grande Bibliothèque in Paris, before it actually got assembled. You know, so it rather looks like a bakery, or it looks something completely different. And the question now is, how do you connect? How do you relate this into a kind of an architectural body? So there. Students, of course, were liberated from a kind of a style or from an expression, and some examples about these early efforts, you could say, to enter a language of a model that is not necessarily anymore, or that does not aspire to explain the project in its entity, but actually tries to describe basically the primary interest of the authors, what they were aiming for and what they were intending to relate to each other. So I found this a very interesting example because you could imagine an entire other building around. You could think maybe that was the building or that was only a kind of a core structure vis-a-vis a invisible shell. So many things actually were explorable through these exercises. And maybe it enlightens why the stressing or why the importance of introducing methodologies back into this scheme of architectural teaching was so important for us because we could actually learn and test different methodologies that were generated, so to speak, out of an artistic approach from our students. Many others, this is a different structural model where the different grains and the different grids, so to speak, speak for different spans, for different operations within one system, how they would actually formulate a hybrid intervention on a structural idea of the building. Even in a very bold way, and that's why I'm trying to give you quite a large horizon about these early works by students on that matter, even if it's a bold expression of a volume that has on first sight not necessarily a clarity, but on a second take, so to speak, speaks as a operation of merging or juxtaposing or relating to it. This was a kind of interesting. Now, what do we do with this? And what we wanted is that through the exploration of it, we are not getting stuck with a context on a very early basis. So we have an architectural idea with the student now, and we actually come back with this architectural idea and trying to engage the context. This was a kind of a larger work with the interesting fact of the dual aspect of practicing and teaching is also that it's not only the teacher that has an experience between practicing and teaching, but it's also finding and searching for partners that are actually also helping us in this process. And we have found out that cities are very interesting partners to think about this dual relationship, because everything that the city has no money or everything that the city has no real courage to think about, we can think about at the academia. And this test laboratory, or you can say this idea of academia, to bring an idea back to, let's say, the responsible directors of urban planning was a very interesting experience, because the project were not asked to be were not asked to have a kind of a reality check, but actually to exactly examine some of the ideas that were linked to the context. So the city actually became a partner of our studio in Mendrisio to examine basically the conditions that the students were elaborating. Now we called it, of course, it was an implementation work. So how can now architectural work be implemented into a continuous site? This was a very large urban district, and we were less interested in the master planning, but more about how this development of hybridization could now deliver a context to a site that the city had absolutely no idea about it. And for those of you that have been in Zurich, this is a very atypical expression of space in Zurich. So this is very rare. This is a large area. This is a large area full of infrastructure, but with absolutely zero vitality and urban quality. So this is very rare. And this also documents the lack of idea of our partner to actually think how infrastructure can be engaged with an architectural program. So you see how we start to construct. We have an exercise where you think about hybridization, where, let's say, a discovery is being transferred into an architectural body, into an architectural relation. And we have a site, actually, that almost speaks of it in a very similar way, that there's a lot of infrastructure, but there's very little of architecture in it. So how can we combine, mix, relate? So this is exactly now how the methodology connects to a site. So every student got the site along this long area. And I'm going to show you quickly 3 projects that we found very interesting. The one is in the foreground, which was a kind of a triangular trapezoid building, and that could actually bear a very large socle or base and a very thin layer. You see how thin the proportion is of houses or housing on top of it. And then further back, a project that we will also quickly see more in detail, which is how a market idea could be combined with a housing idea. And then in the far background, a very thin finger or high-rise building where actually the students combined an industrial factory with a high-rise type. So you see these combinatorial approaches, how things come together, were really examined in large models. So we forced them to build very big models so that architecture really is a part of the production. So it's not that there's a top-down, a master plan, but there is a configuration, a geometry, a proportion, an idea about facade, in this development of the model. Another example how these differences of structural devices start with a very broad system, a system that embeds an industrial factory actually at that site, and then how it could evolve into very, let's say, slender or slim towers of housing. So this insinuation, how things come together, we were really interested in it as a methodological aspect in it to learn from this causal relationships, you know, of having the one and the other, but in the end, in a project like this, you cannot take one thing off anymore. It's really relating to each other. I found this, you see the similarity, of course. I found this project, of course, was very successful, the way that the type of space of a market, a food market, which was based on the contextual reading of the large infrastructure there, was based together with a type of a housing and was almost invading or collapsing or relating to it. This was the long view in it, so it's a kind of a very radical, ambiguous project by students that followed a methodology to target this hybridization in projects. And for us, this aspect of methodology was not that we always have the same method. Just get that, please, right. What our idea was that students were able to design a methodologies to conceive basically exactly this idea of the target. So you see the plans, how absolutely different regions or different domains, so to speak, merge with each other, how they get in contact, and how they are isolating itself again. So we have, of course, a debate, and the debate is also related to our guests, similar to you. And this discussion, basically, of how the typological experiences can be, let's say, seen further was the target of our final review in Mendrisio. So I'm not going to read this, don't worry, but what I'm going to try to say is like this was a kind of important step for us because we knew that we could react with different ambitions in one project. And this was, in a way, a discovery that we have made through these moments of studies at the university. And to make it short here, the methodology that is linked has this kind of early idea of body and plan, how things come together, and it has a different next step that works with typology and implementation. And then the third condition is the composed image. And basically, till today, we work very explicitly with this three-step plan because it delivers an aspiration, so to speak. You can say it delivers an ambition to connect. It kind of introduces the architectural making, how you combine the typologies and how you implement it into the context, and the way you develop the image as an idea of composed image, which means that we basically search for narratives in the image, search for historical moments where we can learn and build into our images. So the model became clearly one of the kind of front runners of the studio, and it helped, of course, that Mendrisio is very much organized like an art school. The school itself is not a technical university, has a different curriculum in that sense. It's really an art school, and it's the only art school in Switzerland to study architecture. Yeah? So the classical curriculum is really the one of the ETH, which is a technical university. And the art school sort of delivers, maybe in contrast, or maybe in the discussion about that, more these explorations on methodology rather than technology. And so the model became a kind of absolutely key development of our own exploration. The way that collages and projects are being described, so the students were asked to not only explore their models, but to find in history similar conditions that we can learn from. This is a staircase by Egon Eiermann. Egon Eiermann was one of the German heroes of modernist architecture. I think one of the most interesting architects in Germany ever. And students actually learned how to implement some of these moments that Eiermann actually designed, and they embedded it in their own perspective, so to speak. So it is like an image that is related to a kind of history, or an image that is related to a kind of a content, and that's what we mean with the idea of narrative. And of course, the last techniques, or the last step, was the plan. So it kind of concludes in the project of the body, the project of the image, and the project of the plan itself, which then, of course, the plan is the great discipline of organization. It's the great discipline of how to organize spaces and cultivate geometry. So this is the extraordinary, I think, condition of this dual practice, that you start to teach your studio exactly in this distillated version, and the next year the year that we have then followed in Mendrisio, we distillated exactly this methodology. We tried to reduce it maybe, and this gives you an impact or an impression how quickly you can understand the project. Now, this was an urban project in Berlin. It is the model. It's clearly clear what the model wants to kind of encompass and to encircle, different scales and connections. This was the architectural model that is an extract of the large urban configuration, but seeks its own architecture in it. This is the narrative of the image that basically exactly examines this connection of what public domain and the public space does as an idea of passage, as an idea of connection. And it's the plan that actually allows you to organize it in a very disciplined way between the private domains and the public domain. So it is basically like a shortcut, and I would wonder how, of course, you as teacher experiences, but every year we teach in Mendrisio, my impression also in the context of the requirements that we have to fulfill is that the design period is almost getting shorter and shorter and shorter. You know, it's like we're dealing only with a 10 weeks cycle, so to speak, and with this distillated three with this distillated three techniques of the model of the plan and the image, we very quickly, on a fragmentary base, but in a very elaborated idea, can perform an idea about the city, an idea about the architecture, and an idea about the space. Some other views. You see the object, you see this is a view from the final review. You see that images have mostly a kind of a dogmatic approach. This was a very courageous student work combining actually a Hilbersheimer condition to the neoliberal condition of Manhattan. It was the project of the German-American Institute right next to the Metropolitan, can you imagine? So it was a very provocative, of course, what sense of order would result, and distillated in exactly the lot that was owned by Germany in that Manhattan mile, so to speak, of Fifth Avenue. The architecture that actually became a storage house to store like a library, or like to store basically the cultural exchange between Germany and the United States. The way that montage, the image, builds up the narrative between those two different regimes, so to speak, this juxtaposition of the regime, and the way that the drawing then was concluded at the final review. You see, these techniques were extremely extra polished to sort of discover the essence of the project, and to examining actually the methodological aspect of how the project has been processed. So this is not the student work, but this is our work. So I shift now to a second part of the lecture. And you see, hopefully, that there are some similarities, you know. So what we're trying to do is that we linking this aspect of strategy, this aspect of interest in a work, to a kind of idea of a model that transcends the idea of gestalt, or that transcends the idea of what the priority is in terms of its expression of architecture. For those of you that are interested, there is a bilingual book which has been published in Park Books, and the English title is called Silent Form, and the German title is Leise Formen. So this aspiration to have a silent form is not that it's either mute or loud, but it's of course something which is maybe a kind of a pre-architectural expression. So it underlines, or is an underlayer of where an architecture could actually go to. And in 2008, so almost 10 years ago, we had the opportunity to exactly examining this methodology with our first project abroad, which was the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Berlin. The Heinrich Böll Foundation is the political foundation of the Green Party in Germany. And what we did at the time, at the competition, we developed a montage, an image that combined the Seagram building with the Farnsworth house. Yeah? And by doing the combination of this, of course it was a mutual consent because it was the same architect, but it was a fundamental difference of architecture within the same building. The Farnsworth building as an expensive building, and the Farnsworth building as a lyric expression of space, cantilevering, and then juxtaposed to a condition of extreme repetition, economy, rules, grids, etc., etc. And the context was that as young architects, we had almost one of the first opportunities to build abroad. I mean, we had at the time only built one building in Switzerland. And it was 7,500 square meters, and it had a budget of 10 million. For Swiss imagination, there was a kind of triple factor missing for this building. And we didn't really understand how to cope with this kind of very drastic expression of lack of budget. And this we transcend. This became the model. So a model that sort of accentuated a unique architecture that's being embedded into a kind of very repetitive architecture. And you see that by doing it, it becomes a kind of an idea of prioritization, but it is also an idea of hybridization. You need the one in order to do the other. You could also say we need to have the quantity to save money, to know where to spend it. So this antagonism, we thought that this was a kind of a very good strategy, and later we found out that it had a link to our own methodology, and this is exactly maybe a good example to explain what this is. So this is exactly the same model. Like that is the architecture, and this is the mathematics of it. And it means that we combined very little points of red extreme expensiveness with a lot of green points of extreme cheapness. Yeah? So in the building there was basically no average, only brutal contrast. Extreme expensive element, one had to be juxtaposed by 200 extremely cheap ones. And we found that what normally is so common in architecture, what is being expressed with mainstream or normality or standard, is the red line. And this is where you have to meet the cost. Yeah? And so what we try to make a polar model, just to push it, and never to meet, so to speak, that red line. So now you understand in this cut of the building, everything which is there occurs only once. And in the rest of the building, everything of the building is being organized through ideas of large repetition. This is how we built a building that cost 10 million. Yeah? And this is, was an experience that now a strategic approach to architecture that is linked to a prioritization needs its own methodology in order to discover and to design. And now you see this is maybe another pivotal relationship to what we're trying to do with our students. Now this was the plan, the expensive plan. This is the cheap plan. And this is where the politicians like to be. Guess where? Is of course the expensive space. Now, I'm going to go through some of the body of our work, but I'm stressing this again, this methodology aspect in it, and not necessarily the deepening of the architectural expression, because I was also aware that there will be another lecture next Monday, which gives us, or me, the opportunity also to deepening the architecture in it. So this was a similar project. This was a master plan by the city. This is not our model, but it's the master plan by the city. This is nowadays also in Zurich very fashionable. The city makes a master plan. Architecture can be done by the architects, so don't think about the city, only do the architecture. And what it should be was the kind of request for one of those global headquarters, and in Madrid is a fantastic example also how very famous big banks migrate after 20 years. They need another headquarter, and then they go from a great building to a next great building. So this is the same process or the same procedure where every time a global consultancy firm grows till the point that they need a new headquarter. And what is a headquarter? We found the program extremely boring because everything was defined, everything. A vice director gets a room, has a secretary, even how many plotters, everything is defined. Nothing to explore than productivity of space, which is, let's say, a discipline of the plan, but is not related to invention. And there was only basically a little hint in the program that the only thing that the corporate world wasn't really sure about it was where and how their meeting center should be and how it should be organized. And we found that very interesting because that was about 10% of the project, of the whole program. And we tried to use the meeting center on the foot of this high-rise and try to sort of erode this as a kind of a complementary architecture. You could say we tried to do with 10% such a dominant impact that we were not related on the 90%. So there is a condition of different approaches, two different architectures that relate, but they merge and form a new common singularity, like the exercise of our student. This was the meeting center. This was the office. And of course, you put it together, you fuse it, and you basically observe what it kind of delivers as an architectural ingenuity of voids, of exclusions, of exceptions, so to speak, of something which you can call a great regularity. So you see this parallel condition, the expression of those voided spaces, and the expression of the facade, which kind of reminded us to a kind of almost equalizer that sort of invades the classic expression of the corporate world, so to speak, the typecasted or the preconceived condition of office. Now, as we go to Berlin back years later, almost 10 years, we have been invited to a very particular competition, and it was the headquarters of the very leftish newspaper of Berlin. It's called the Taz, die Tageszeitung. And this was the shot we made from the first visit, and it was a huge mess. We were, in a way, paralyzed by the way that the entire agency or newspaper actually worked. And we proposed at the time, within this kind of development of the competition, an idea that the entire perimeter would become a structure, in a way that the structure would also stiff out the building so that the internal condition could be completely emptied. And we did this because at the opening or at the beginning or at the kickoff of the competition, the head of the newspaper said like they had no clue how media is going to evolve, and they had no idea how actually the newspaper was going to develop over the long run, but they knew that they want to sort of concentrate all their activity in that building. So we designed a building that was focusing only on this marginal condition of the edge between inside and outside. We designed the building basically as a diaphragma that stabilized and used the edge to organize a span of 14 meters spatial depth. You see here the structural model. In order to allow all the messes, all the unpredictabilities to happen actually in the building. And this was the kind of resulting plan of this media agency, where basically you had enormous depth in the plan, you had different wings in the building, and a central core that was a void to organize the light. This became the architecture. It is a kind of a diaphragm. It's a kind of a concentration between the structural engineer and the architect meet through their making basically this edge. These are very recent images. The building will be finished hopefully next week in Berlin. This is the ground level. And the expression of the architecture is more an architecture of that uses this infrastructural condition, or uses this framework of emptiness, so to speak, inside to be filled, occupied, and organized by someone else. This, you see, like has a kind of a warehouse character, large open workshop spaces, and the way that the building sits in the city. So we concluded also here that it was a kind of a success that we could work through this methodological aspect in it, to say something is very important and maybe something else is not important, or something is important that architects design and something is maybe much more relevant that the owner actually discovers it and formulates for itself. This project, and you see we're pivoting a lot between Zurich and Berlin, this project is a very emotional one, because it is the first time that we've been exposed not to a client, but to a circle of architects. This is the project of the new Werkbundsiedlung in Berlin, and you remind maybe that 1921, the Werkbundsiedlung in Stuttgart, where Mies van der Rohe made the design, the master plan, Corbusier built a very prominent building, J.P. Out made beautiful row houses. This idea about Siedlung get changed, and the title of 100 years later was Werkbundstadt, and the Werkbund Berlin invited 35 architects to conclude on a plan and to do an architecture together. And it was quite a challenge. These were the architects. This is my brother, the one, and this is my teacher, so Hans Kohlhoff. So there was a kind of very interesting meeting between teacher and former student working together on one project. So it's also a kind of pivotal relationship that you rediscover your teacher, so to speak, as a partner on the level of a master plan and on the level of an architectural expression. And of course there was a master plan, but I'm trying to make another point here. And I thought that housing is such a, let's say, not only a very relevant issue, but of course a very tough issue to really work also on a very conceptual base. We proposed a geometry, we proposed a model of interest now that works with always the same space. And it is a model where every room is 20 square meter. And now you have a 3-piece apartment with 60 square meter, you have a 4-piece apartment with 80 square meter, etc., etc. And the interesting fact of it is that you could combine these spaces in any direction. And it brought back a kind of a very strong architectural, let's say almost a Baroque idea of enfilade, which is a architecture that is disconnected from the imminent, directly preconceived use of its surface. So you can say this architecture, you can say like I can put the piano in, I can put 4 beds for my children in, or I can put anything I want in, and this makes the building an urban project, a project that has a great sense of vitality because everyone of the society could use it in different ways, mix it up, and in different constellations. So we were interested basically to get this model done also in a kind of circumstance of housing, because housing still links very much to this modernist idea of minimal, where you have a living, where you can live, where you have a sleeping room, where you can sleep, but it's very hard to actually interchange or to do the living in the sleeping room and vice versa. This project basically is or works exactly with the same methodology to erode maybe a kind of a normality, to explore the possibility of equal spaces, and therefore turn it into a kind of architectural and urban language of the projects. This is a public school which is under construction, and it also is a very delicate question because there are 2 existing schools, and in the middle is our extension. And it is a national heritage, so we have to be very careful. And we proposed a very flat volume that has a kind of a very particular roof, not only because we thought the roof was working well with the neighborhoods, with this pitch roof condition, but because the school was a hybrid in its structure. It was a school that was built on top of a gym room, and the gym room basically was sunk into the ground. The result was that there was a complex structure spanning the gym, and then only 1 layer on top of it for the entire school. And that produced a very deep plan. And the deep plan asked for these different sheds and different relationships of roof lighting, and it was embedded into a kind of a very strong expression of the facade, of the primary facade of the school. And this was the lighting concept, so you see that the lighting was basically facilitating the deep plan, so the roof organized basically, or was a tool to organize a different plan. And you see how it works. It's a 2-way direction, so you see the 1 skylight for the classroom, the other skylight basically for the aisle. And this you see now in the section, how the sections are now mutating. This is almost the vernacular or the pitch regularity. Then it actually moves into the skylight of the aisle. It kind of reacts as a skylight into the classroom. And it kind of concludes it into these pivoting pitch roofs, producing a perpendicularly rotated classroom, so a deep plan, so to speak, lit from 2 sides, and an aisle that profits from this negative or from that other side of the skylight. So we could evolve, in a way, an architecture that can or could be done only because of its particular moment of fusion to build the school on top of a gym room. So this is the long section. You see this relation. You see how the structure actually works for 2 ways. So the structural layer on ground level becomes the skylight of the hall. You see, this is the gym room. So this is all, like, maybe you have seen many gym rooms like this, but the fact is like that this becomes almost the preconceived condition to explore somewhere else. And this was the plan that we have developed, so a kind of very deep plan of the classrooms, organizing a very strong rhythm in the plan. Ground level, gym room. You see that constraints, and this is a good example that comes up, is an opportunity. So what we have learned, I started this lecture, that from our teacher we have learned to make a cohesion in our project. And the question now that my generation is being exposed to is that we have to marry or combine things that originally you would not necessarily marry. You know, it's like there's a gym room and there's a class, and the moment you fuse, it kind of creates opportunity. For housing, this project basically, or this procedure was always a very difficult one for us. Because, as I said at the Werkbund, we thought that housing was still one of the last bastions of total design, of a total conceivement by the architects. This project was exposed in a park, and we had three-sided extreme noise. In Switzerland, it's forbidden to build a housing project with an exposed noise pattern of higher than 75 dBA on your facade. You are not allowed to build it unless you create a possibility of ventilation that allows you to really do a project and organize basically a ventilation on a calm side. And what we have done is we developed a kind of a zigzag that in its line is almost 150% of the straight line. So what we would do is we made a very expensive intervention. We made a long facade that is longer than it used to be. And because we did it, we have more surface to ventilate. And what this delivers, I found very interesting, because it delivers a housing that can be developed through its specificity of site and context, and can create a kind of a very stable condition. This is the expression, but it generates a very dense, a very tight balcony structure on the inside. So the constraint allows you to actually introduce a new liberty of architecture. If the noise pattern would not be there, I could not design this, because it would have been straightened out by all the clients that we would have. So there is a kind of almost an opportunistic relationship in the methodology of the design to use the constraint for the sake of the architecture that can arise. So you see the top view, this proximity, and the particular condition of the plan that negotiates the orthogonal beginning of the outer facade and the kind of directed condition to the inner core that allows to ventilate and that allows to geometrize an architecture, an apartment, that almost like an écriture automatique puts the architecture in relation to that discovery, to that sort of strategic aspect in it. You see how the houses or the apartments are basically organized, like all the time the sleeping and the living is ventilated towards the calm side. And it produces its own particularity in it, its own density, its own expression of architecture, its own sense of repetition, its own sense of housing regularity. So this is the last project that I would like to show, which is also a very young project, and it's also stressing the methodology of it. This is the national television. And there was a master plan by a well-known colleague of us designed, and the project was this. Now, we mapped the condition of television, and there was really an interesting discovery for us. And you see it on this entire sort of timeline, you know, 1920, first television sets in the US. In the 40s, the first remote control, the 60 TV audiences, LCD green in the 90s. 2007, Steve Jobs, Cupertino, introduction of iPhone. A big change to the media. 2016, the Olympic Games in Rio, the coverage, the average of Swiss audiences looked the Olympic Games on their iPhone. 60% of all coverages were seen through iPhones. What is a television? This was it. This is it. And it doesn't mean that the future has no collective dimension, but there is a kind of fusion between the individual and the collective at the same time. You can say what used to be the studio and the bureaucracy of a national broadcasting company busted into full of soap bubbles. Studios could be 10 square meters. Broadcasting companies could be 5 square meters. How to rule it? So we got very much reminded to the expression of the Taz, and we got very much reminded to this idea how to open up basically a system. This was the structure. This was our methodology model, so to speak. 3 layers, 32-meter spans, very large structures in hardly any preconceived conditions. This was the plan. So you see here no structure along, then a middle section. This was 32 meters, both sides lit. So basically only an offer on surfaces that got and could be exploited in any direction with any regime of flexibility and relation and potential program. And you see, you immediately recognize these media buildings with huge slabs and big halo core elements. And this was the architecture, kind of an architecture that tried to kind of align this long slabs, open, empty spaces. Just this kind of tilting of the 2 regimes, of the big space frames meeting the space. The staircase actually as a meeting point, as a place to connect, to relate, to use, to explore. And this killed the project. And maybe you recognize, it was a very small news on BBC, and it was a very interesting documentary in Hong Kong. And it was just a small kid in the background that entered actually the space of the report of that journalist. And it was the end of the architectural frame, and the project got cancelled. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Pete. It was amazingly interesting what you showed us today, and I think it was clearly in the line of what we were expecting. Yo creo que ha sido una intervención fantástica en el sentido de lo que estábamos buscando, ¿no? Un vínculo claro entre las búsquedas en lo que se llama academia, ¿no? Que nosotros llamamos la escuela, y la práctica profesional, que en tu caso claramente ha ido fuertemente vinculada, ¿no? A lo que planteabais. Abrimos un momento de conversación. We open a moment of conversation, some questions or comments, maybe even some doubts about what has been shown, which would be also interesting. So please, now we open up the questions, if anyone wants to.
very short one. You talk about constraints, that is part of your work, and part of your work in the academia, which is to talk about restrictions and how to focus in one direction that is very, very fixed by you. And for me, it's really strange to see the whole lecture, or the 90% of the lecture, without color. So what about without color? Color, like these things. What about color in terms of the architectural conditions of the color? Because it's related with the materiality, etc. So you are taking apart this area of the architecture, but in your proposals, at the end, when you are producing architecture, you are using color. So what about the color in these both fields?
It's very good. It's a very good question, because if you talk about strategy, and if you talk about, let's say, these anti-linguistic architectural expressions of a strategy model, that is the form of your tactics, so to speak, we eliminate the aspect of material in it. Yeah? Because we don't want to fall in love, we don't want to be seduced, we want to be extremely cold-blooded. Yeah? Because we don't find it otherwise, or we don't meet it, so to speak, on that strategic level anymore. And I fully agree that since this is about this pivoting relationship, that where we examining the methodology of this relation, how we can evolve the relation of two things, how things come together. The materiality of the project is a next step. You know, is a step that sort of is a work towards the realization of the project, but it's not linked to, let's say, the strategy of the project. And that's why we refrain simply from coloring or seducing or trying to go through the phenomena of materiality into the space. There are great teachers in Mendrisio that teach this, and this would be then within the curriculum possible, but you won't get it in our class, you know, because we are interested in a kind of a different subject of it. And that's the main issue about it. I'm really curious what you say on Monday, because on Monday we talk about really the making of architecture in the sense of its materiality. That's why I have to postpone the definite answer on it. Yeah, but you promised anyway to be there, so I'm still kind of confident on that matter.
We can call that auto-promotion, no? Like self-publicity. Okay, any more? No, hay una cuestión que yo lanzo y seguimos con otras preguntas, pero creo que era muy interesante, y es que hemos visto que los planteamientos docentes pasaban como del mundo del arte a la ciudad, ¿no? You were talking about art on one side and city on the other side, on your proposals for the students, no? I think that proposals within the city, which were very much linked to the actual professional and disciplinary approach, no? Are not so normal always. No? We were talking about that before, the fact that in Mendrisio, for example, there are many proposals about working in like wonderful places or in the desert or in imaginary situations, but this linked to the real city in your proposals is something that probably is not always what we are doing, even in our studio classes. No? So how that I think there is something about I mean a thought about how can the search in academia can be directly related to these difficulties of the city that you were founding, that were not addressed by city planners, etc., and that you were trying to link with that in cities in which you are working or living, like Zurich or Berlin or probably New York. You know? I think that is something which is not so normal, no, in our school also.
Maybe let me react in two ways on this remark. I think that the context we deliver for the studio is always an urban context. Yeah, we want to deal with the city, and the studio wants to develop answers to questions of how the city can evolve. So we don't give out a context outside of a city or without an urban issue. This maybe I haven't really stressed or I haven't really underlined so much in the lecture. But what we see is, and I hope that you have discovered that, is that since our methodology works with constraints in the practice, in practicing, the student and in a university we use not constraint, but actually a artistic relation of it to tackle that. You know, we don't. That's why I said we don't want to make a pseudo practice. We don't give out quasi constraints how to solve it, but the student actually studies the combinations, studies possibilities of how I can organize a form and relate it to another. They work much more proactively in the sense of a hybrid, you know, and they don't have to find an answer that this would deliver an added value to that and that and that. This is what happens later when they are doing architecture at practice. But that's why I'm saying, so it's the context of the city in academia, and it's a context of trying to use artistic expressions of different conditions to bring together as an answer to bring back to the city. And the pivot in practice is actually to respond to discrepancy, to constraint itself, you know. So this is maybe a shift of reality versus the ideal condition we're trying to test or to secure, so to speak, in academia.
I missed one point, thank you for your lecture, which is where the idea of hybridization came from, and because it is clear that it generates a lot of possibilities and the results are really, really interesting, but it has been a research to answer which problem, which question that is now to the city. I missed this starting point. If you can clarify it.
Well, I mean, the starting point is the experience in both. This is the dual experience. You know? The starting point is to realize that we have not been asked anymore as architects to think about one morphology anymore. You know, they want to have 10 things at the same time. You know, this is a contemporary condition. This erodes the idea of cohesion. This is what I wanted to say. If you import this into the academic world, we make exercises that could deliver new approaches for that. But what we try to exclude in this discussion is that the student don't have to kind of respond on this idea of the way we experience this in practice. You know, there is a transition from the discovery in practice to the methodology in the academics. Otherwise, you suffer or you risk that you organize a teaching as a pseudo-practice. You understand that? So you don't want to do that. You know, you want to give the students a liberty to explore a condition that they later can relate to a context, and they don't have to tell me why a combination of high-rise and market is better than something else. You see what I mean? I'm not the investor. I'm not playing it. You know, I leave it to them. And the discovery of us, we can carry that out. I said that maybe also that it's actio e reactio. You know, so you want to have both as a teacher. You want to teach but learn as well. You know, as the many actually students have the same relation or the same pivot condition to have something to give to the studio, but also to learn something from the studio. So it's a kind of a double-sided sword, you know, so to speak.
Yeah. I found interesting that you mentioned that your master at the university was Hans Koldhoff. So I wondered if there's any continuity between the way you were taught at the university and the way you're teaching project design right now. Is there any continuity, or is that disruption from trauma, or?
No.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a good question, because it's a kind of a heraldic question, you know. It's like I wasn't expecting that, but I think that, you know, we studied under Hans Koldhoff the moment where he built the Casa en Borneo in Amsterdam, which I think in the end became one of the strongest brick buildings in the Netherlands, built by a German. So let's say it was a period where the introduction to architecture was related to exercise, where exercise, number one, or the experience of exercise was not be asked to be literally taken over with architecture, but was open up topics, individual topics for you to search, to discover, to understand, to break the repertoire of your own knowledge, you know, because otherwise you become a prisoner of your own repertoire, you know. It's like if you always do what you know you do, you can't discover, yeah. So, and Hans understood is in a very fantastic way to break repertoire of his students. And by doing it, he allowed us to open up a discovery, but later he forced us to do it in his architecture, you understand? Mm-hmm. And that's why I think you could say he still forced us in this cohesiveness of his regime, yeah? I mean, I don't think that it was a problem for me, you know? But I experienced it in a way also quite limiting, because I could not go on with certain discoveries, so to speak, you know. But I would say it has a continual relation, because we've been formed by a very, very strong personality that was totally convinced that the discovery was your thing, the architecture was his thing, you know. And I think that my generation has really severely suffered a shift in the discipline of architecture. Although in Switzerland we are very comfortable still in comparison with others. But the way architecture is being produced, architecture is being influenced, architecture being sabotaged is completely different today than at the time where Hans Koldhoff could make this building in Amsterdam. And that's, for me, a sign that methodology has to evolve, has to go on. But of course, it's a relation of continuity in that sense, to carry it to the next level of it. But there was always fun and pain in his class. Yeah? It was part of the game. And I learned a lot from it. Yeah?
Okay, any more questions?
I think it's very clear now. No?
Perfect. On Monday, more questions, no?
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Pete.
Thank you.
Nice, very nice. Really, I mean, it was really onto what we were asking you to show us. So thank you very much for the effort.
No. It's a pleasure. Hey.
But I mean, it's clear that you have thought on it, you know, which is. I mean,
This is your, huh?
is this open here? Your bag? I don't know.
Thank you very much to make thinking people. You have to do a building in Barcelona?
I don't know.
This is like Berlin, Switzerland, related to the culture and the site.
Yeah.
I would like to see
good.
one of your buildings in.
I have it.
I made it already. No, this was for Monday lecture. This is for just your name, your time, not all the data. Just your name and your and see you Monday, no? Monday here.